I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Pour It Over. And if you don't know Elizabeth O'Connor's name yet, I promise you will. Whale Fall is her first novel published in the States, and it is fantastic. And it is tiny. Wait, hold on. I have a galley right here. It is tiny. It is so petite. It's 200. There's the finished copy. It's, 203 pages. Some chapters are a paragraph long, and this book is beautiful. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're in 1938. We're off the coast of Wales. This island is 3 miles by 1 mile and has 12 families, right? Did I remember all of that correctly? Okay.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So how did we get here? Because you and I are talking obviously in 2024.
Yeah, and I'm also talking to you from Birmingham in the UK, which is about as far from a coastline as you can get in the UK. So, yeah, so how did we get here? So I think a few things that kind of came together at once. So I'm from Birmingham, but my grandparents were both from very isolated coastal places. My grandmother was from the North Welsh coast and my grandfather from the West Irish coast. They came from these really tiny, really isolated places. And there were places that I always found really interesting, found that passage really interesting from these very rural places to larger cities where they ended up, and the things that were kind of lost and gained, and what that passage would have been like. And then the other thing that I found really inspiring was learning about some of the histories of islands around the coast of the British Isles. So there are places like St Kilda in the Outer Hebrides, Bardsey Island off the coast of Wales, places like the Blasket Islands in Ireland as well. There were places that had sort of quite turbulent histories at the start of the 20th century. So a lot of them were either formally evacuated because of declining populations and because of changing weather conditions, modernisation on the mainland, young people leaving. So some were formally evacuated, and some just really saw this very sudden decline in the community that lived there as people sort of moved away from the place, and also a particular way of life that was quite particular to that time. So I was really interested in those two things, I think, and that's how I ended up there. I was particularly close to my grandmother, who was the Welsh side of my family, so that's why we ended up in Wales rather than in Scotland or Ireland. I was really wanting to put a lot of her into the novel, so that's where the Wales bit comes from.
The setting is gorgeous. I have to say, though, I'm glad that it's not me who's there full time.
Yeah.
I mean, Manon is 18. She's finished school. She's taking care of her little sister. Her mother is not around, and her dad is a lobsterman, and they are living a very, very, very tight existence. And really, in 1938, on a place like this, marriage is kind of the only thing. And she's looking at this going, thank you, no. Not for me. But she doesn't really have any options. And a classmate who has left to be married on the mainland sends her a note saying, well, how are you doing? I finally have indoor plumbing.
Yeah, so exciting.
And that's when I knew I was really in a place that I had not been fully prepared for, I think. I mean, I knew we were on an island. I knew it was sort of, well, historical fiction, but I mean, I was reading it blind. I didn't even have sort of a bound galley or anything like that. I was like, okay, let's see what happens here. But how did you find this girl?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. She went through a lot of different roles, I would say, as I was writing. So the narrator originally was the younger sister you mentioned, so sort of taking a much younger perspective. But I found myself always drawn to the older sister. I think there was something about her being 18 and kind of in that place where she has to make this decision between staying on the island, moving to the mainland. As I say, on these islands that I was inspired by, it was that generation into war. There were these kind of opportunities, women starting to go to university or make lives for themselves, but also still being a lot of barriers. So class is another big barrier to Manod. The fact she comes from this very working class rural community where not living on an island, not fishing for a living, not farming for a living is just not heard of. As you say, her becoming a wife is kind of the only option. So I think there was just something about her being in that place that was really compelling to me. And I felt that also really reflected her surroundings. So this sense of, I mean, I love writing about shores because I love that they're kind of this in-between space that's not water, not land, always changing, always corroding, always moving with the tides. So I liked that then Manod herself was kind of stuck between these two worlds, kind of occupying this quite in-between space.
Liminal space, man. Liminal space. That is the exact place any of us want to be when we're in a novel, right? But I want to go back to something you just said a second ago. The evacuations from these tiny islands in real life, did the majority of them happen between World War I and World War II? Is that sort of, or did they just continue until relatively recently?
Yeah, they did continue, I think. So the ones I mainly read about were St. Kilda, which was 1930, I think, or early 30s. And then Blasket Islands was early 1950s. So it was almost quite a slow burn, I suppose.
I mean, there are some people on some of these islands, correct? But the majority are now uninhabited, or maybe there's a handful of sheep left over or something like that?
Yeah, or it's people who are there. They don't, what's the word? They're not permanent residents, I suppose. Like they might go over for a job posting for 2 years, recording birds or something like that. Or yeah.
So it's more wildlife sanctuary, more still. I mean, there is no actual economy on these places, right? Like you can't even, there's not a corner store. You have to get on a boat and go to the mainland if you want to do any kind of shopping beyond, or, selling the lobsters like Manon's dad.
Exactly. And even then, you're sailing to quite an isolated part of North Wales or Western Ireland, and they're still, you're not sailing to a city, you're still sailing to a tiny rural village that's just slightly better connected, maybe.
I mean, talk about knowing all of your classmates, right? I mean, it's a one-room schoolroom. You are there from the first day, and then when you're done, you're sort of thrown out into the world. And Manod comes into contact. There are two students. What do we want to call them exactly? Edward and Joan, researchers. Yeah. Okay. So we have a dead whale. Dead whale that washes up. And this sort of sets the stage for these two people. And they're not necessarily there to deal with the whale, but it makes it possible for them to show up. And you do a lot in 203 pages. You do a lot. And these people, Joan and Edward, are really sort of the key to a lot of it. Obviously, you and I are not going to talk about spoilers. I realize the book has been out for a minute since we were talking, but at the same time, watching how you sort of reveal what happens and how it happens, I think is one of the great pleasures of Whale Falls. So we're going to talk sort of around the specifics. But I do want to talk about Joan and Edward and the difference between them and Manod, because they hire her essentially to be a translator. Yeah. They speak English. They do not speak Welsh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they, as you say, they arrive on the island. They've heard of it through the appearance of this whale on the shore. And they're studying sort of small rural communities along the Welsh coast, recording folk stories and folk traditions and the kind of ways of life. So when they get to the island, they, as you say, are looking for a translator, and they find Manod, who can speak English very well. She's one of the few people on the island who can speak their language, as well as the island Welsh. And I think for Manod, they kind of represent that mainland kind of sophistication and opportunity that she's been dreaming of and sort of imagining for herself with no real knowledge of how to get it. And then suddenly they've arrived on the shore of her island. They came from a lot of research that I did into the way these islands, real life islands, were portrayed in popular culture in the first half of the 20th century. So there were some island autobiographies, memoirs published by islanders at the time, became a sort of real literary interest. And so there were some reviews and essays about these. And I just found the language that was used to describe them really loaded, I suppose. So there was one essay in particular by E.M. Forster, which described a memoir of the Blasket Islands as sort of being a vestige of a primitive culture.
That's so patronizing.
Exactly. Yeah, it's meant positively.
That's so patronizing.
But it's so loaded. And yeah, so I found that really interesting. And there was also in the 30s this documentary made by an American director of the Aran Islands. And it later came out there were lots of errors, lots of sort of fabrications about life on the island that had been portrayed as real. Yeah, so it felt like there was really something there between how the island was seen by outsiders, how outsiders would actually want to see the island, what they expected to see on it, and what it was actually like for people to be living there. I mean, we talked at the start about the place where they live being so beautiful, but also you actually kind of wouldn't really want to live there yourself because it is quite a hard life. So it's kind of that, looking into that balance, I suppose.
Joan's single, she's educated, she wears lipstick even on the island.
Yeah.
Manod's head kind of explodes a little bit when she meets Joan. She's like, wait, you don't have to be married? You don't have to. The lipstick comes later, but you don't have to be married. And that connection, and Manod knowing that there's more to the world out there, it seems so small in some ways, like lipstick, what? But then you realize this kid has no experience beyond what's happening. This could have been physically a much larger, longer novel. So I want to talk craft for a second because, I mean, historical fiction doesn't always... You and Carys Davis, actually, seem to like to write very tight. And Clear, if you haven't read Clear, please go find that. It's not dissimilar, although it is 18-something. It's a different moment. It's off the Scottish coast, but at the same time, there's a feeling and a temperature to the book that is not dissimilar to you and whatnot. But how did you settle on the form that Whalefall ultimately took? Because, I mean, we've got some chapters that are 6-8 pages. We've got some chapters that are a paragraph. We've got some that, I mean, I loved the variety. It really worked for me and it kept pulling me through the story. But it's a very deliberate choice, style-wise.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you said about that the book could be sort of twice as long, and that could have been a choice that I made. And it was something that was posed to me when we were, well, first of all, when I was trying to find an agent for the book, that was something that a few agents said to me, was that they'd want me to double the word count. And similarly, when we were looking at publishers as well, a couple of them, it was, wanting to make it more of a standard novel length. I felt that I liked the shortness of the novel. I'm someone who's a big fan of short novels, and I think they are kind of increasingly popular now. We definitely have Claire Keegan to thank for putting small novels on that in the last couple of years.
Thank you, Claire. Well, I mean, also Samantha Harvey, Orbital. I mean, obviously very different in tone and material and everything else, but give me a tightly short. Paul Harding did it with This Other Eden. I mean, there's some really fun, interesting stuff.
What I did want to do with the structure of the novel was really find a way to sort of embed and express the landscape of the novel within the structure of it. So I really love like Annie Proulx, and I think she does that really well with like language and structure. And so there was something about these short, fragmentary chapters and sections that I felt really suited that. This, to me, hopefully, it's kind of a sense of things being washed up and taken away, sort of things arriving half formed, that sort of sense of an ebb and flow, and the kind of fluidity of this landscape that's kind of always changing, and having things arrive and having things leave, and sort of explores what it means to live in a place like that. So that's what I was trying to do with the structure, that sense of it being very tidal and coastal.
There's a line you have a minor character's mother has a collection of dishware, and it's mostly broken pieces of dishware because it's what washes up from, shipwrecks and accidents and all sorts of things. And so few of the pieces are whole that it's supposed to be lucky when you find a piece that's actually intact. Or Manon has clothing that she's either repurposed because it's washed up in someone's suitcase, or she's been able to wear it exactly. Whalefall for me is this combination of timelessness, right? And also feeling like I'm completely out of time. Like pulled out of time, that it's this not magical island. I don't want it to sound like I feel like you've dropped us in the middle of Narnia and the off the coast of Wales. It's not that. But it is, there's something very haunting about it. There are some sort of holiday things that happen towards the end of the book. And I'm not going to give up the details there, but it's very rooted in the culture and the folklore of this place. And again, it's 1938. We're leading up to World War II. We are watching a community. And I'm sure there are equivalents in the United States. Please don't misunderstand me, that there are, similar rural communities that found themselves in really sticky wickets because there were no jobs. There was, what do you do when there are no jobs? But also 1938 feels very deliberate. It feels like you were able to play with some ideas about modern life and politics, because all art is political. Yeah, can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah, so I suppose I came to the interwar period from this research into historical islands, and so I was sort of already looking 30s, 40s, 50s kind of thing. But yes, 38 became very deliberate, I think for a few reasons. So what I really wanted to do with the novel, what these islands from history had made me really think about, was they were living at this time where their world was on the edge of great change, great destruction, really. They could see these kind of changing weather conditions. They could see a lot of modernization happening in other places. And they knew that perhaps their way of life was dying out or disappearing. And so I felt that there was something there on our own relationships with nature in an age of climate change, and this kind of sense we have of landscapes being really infused with alienation and loss. We know and are already seeing the fact that people are being displaced by extreme weather conditions, changing weather conditions. So I felt there was just this tie to our times, sort of about that change. It felt as though having the Second World War on the horizon for the island really emphasised that link to kind of modern age. And when I was editing, I kind of had the war in Ukraine on the horizon for us in the UK. And then obviously later on, there's the war in Palestine. And so it feels like that kind of feeling of unease and the kind of horror of war that feels both close by and quite distant. And then I suppose the last thing, and without wanting to give too much away, is just wanting to explore kind of through relationships to nature and modern relationships to nature, where more uneasy narratives come in, especially around sort of right-wing views, around kind of purity of the land, around who owns the land, idealization of rural communities and working communities and how they might be exploited by certain narratives. For the UK as well, I mean, we saw so many things around Brexit, around we're an island and we're separate from the EU, and these kind of really horrible narratives around islands being invaded by people in boats. And it just felt like there was something about islands and right-wing commentary that felt really vivid to me as someone from a contemporary age. And it felt like leading up into the Second World War was where the kind of last time we kind of saw those ideas really having coming to light. So those are the kind of things floating around setting it in 1938.
It really works for the characters too. I really like Manon. I really like that kid. And I understand her. I understand. I know she's 18, but she's a kid. I understand her frustration, but she loves and respects her community. It frustrates her, doesn't thrill her, but she doesn't dislike them. She doesn't think she's better than them. She doesn't think she's any different. She just thinks, hey, wait a minute. And I do love this one detail that you tossed in there where part of the reason her English is so good is because she reads the women's magazines that have been left behind by other people who have come through town. And so the idea that she can pull, right, there's always this high-low thing happening, right? Like, just learn. Just learn. It doesn't, learn and figure out where you want to go. And so, I mean, it's a very sort of classic coming of age. You just sort of twist the outside. And I'd just done sort of a mini reread of some William Trevor stories. And I was thinking about things like The Hill Bachelors. It's for a different episode of the show, and I'm now doing the math going, are you airing before that show or not? But that timelessness too, he does a similar thing in the short stories where really, how else do you talk about isolation and rural life? It's like, oh, right, William Trevor's been doing this for a minute. I know you talked about Annie Proulx as an influence, and certainly Claire Keegan to a certain extent. But who else are some of the writers who've made Elizabeth O'Connor novelists?
So I would say the big ones. One would be Rachel Carson. I read a lot of her nature writing, sort of while I was writing, especially her short stories. She did some short stories early on which weren't fictional, but they sort of illustrated the life of the shore. They were almost like ecology stories. And I found that really influential. I really love a writer called Elisa Schuer-Duesprin. I never know if I'm saying her name right. She's quite recent. I think she's her third novel came out this year. She's another short novel writer. And yeah, she's fantastic, and she has a really interesting style that's kind of quite spare and a little bit detached, but sort of has these real moments of emotional depth that cut through. I think those are the main ones, along with the others we've spoken about.
So you were always going to be a writer then? You started thinking about this when you were young, didn't you?
Yeah, I think so. I think I always loved reading, and I always loved the idea of writing, but it was kind of, I didn't quite click that it was something I could do. Right. That took longer.
Do you remember the book that made you a reader?
I remember a book I loved when I was a child, which was a book of, maybe unsurprisingly, British folk stories that my mum used to read to me. And I do remember one in particular that I loved that was almost like a ghost story, and it was quite strange. And I think it was just that feeling of that you could put this real feeling of strangeness and have quite a visceral reaction in a reader, a reaction of fear and unease. I remember that really capturing me when I was young.
Yeah, the difference between fairy tales and the way we present them to tiny people versus what the folklore is. There are some freaky differences. There's some freaky discrepancies. I'm like, I'm sorry, you're not kidding. They cut their feet. They actually cut their feet off so they could fit into the shoe. And I mean, if you think about sort of what we used folklore for, right? Controlling sort of, not necessarily in a creepy way, but you want to keep the children alive. So please don't go into the woods because you're going to die. Don't eat the things that you see growing on the side of a tree. You'll die. But then to have sort of this cleaned up version where it's like, well, la-di-da-di-da, everyone's sort of running down the woodland path. It's kind of a trip.
Yeah, it is wild. Yeah.
Do you see yourself doing something really different for the next book? I assume you're working on whatever the new thing is.
Yeah, so working on the second one at the moment. And yeah, it's interesting because in some ways it feels like I'm exploring quite similar themes to this novel, but it's set in a very different time and different place. And what has surprised me and what I'm trying to work out at the moment is actually how my writing has to change to tell a different story. I think I didn't quite realise how much my actual writing sort of structurally and in terms of language was really shaped to this story. Yeah.
I'm also going to remind you too, like Ishiguro did
Never Let Me Go.
Yeah, thank you.
Right? Yeah.
But I mean, we're talking about the guy who created The Remains of the Day, right? And also Never Let Me Go. And yet there's a consistency between the two. And honestly, I do not feel bad describing Never Let Me Go as the cloning novel because it's 15 years old at this point.
Yeah.
You and I are talking about a book that's been out in the States for not that long. You know, your book. But at the same time, I love the idea that you can, as a novelist, pick up sort of a general idea of where you want to go and then sort of work backwards a little bit, it sounds like.
Exactly. Yeah.
How long did it take you to write Whalefall?
It took me around 4 years,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. Start to finish.
How much of the writing is the rewriting for you?
Not much, actually. I tend to spend a lot of time writing it out for the first time and then less time editing, I think.
When you did the first pass, you were really close to what we're holding in our hands now, yeah?
Yeah, really. Not a lot changed, I think, once the book was finished to now.
Okay. So who were you showing it to as you were working, though? I mean, do you have sort of a circle of folks? And I mean, you were working on it before you lined up your agent, too. So your agent input comes later, your editor input comes later. So how are you? Because this is the first novel you've written, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't show it to anyone while I was writing it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was a real secret kind of project.
So just trusting yourself until you get the thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think also not knowing if I was ever going to finish it. So, yeah.
All right. So you're pulling from your grandparents' story, pulling from folklore, pulling from all of these different places, and you end up with a story that really is yours, though, right? You know what I'm talking about when I say that. So did you accomplish the thing that you set out to do when you sat down to write Whalefall? Did you ultimately get the story that you saw and wanted?
That's such a good question. I think the answer's yes and no. I did get what I set out to do, I think. And I think everything I wanted to do in terms of questions I wanted to ask, themes I wanted to explore is all in the final novel. But I think the final form of it is probably very different to what I first imagined it would be.
Did it change you? Did it change your relationships when you wrote this novel?
That's a great question. I think I'm sure it probably did. I think it has made me a lot more attentive maybe to the things that influence me. It surprised me quite a lot as I was writing what came up, what I remembered, what I took from. And I think now, I'm much more kind of aware of that.
It does feel like the second novel might be you have some problem solving to do, but you might actually have kind of a roadmap for where you want to go. Sounds like it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. But it's interesting doing the second novel. It's been so surprising in so many ways because you do the first novel and you think, oh, well, I've done one, so I know how to write a novel. I know what I'm doing. And then you sit down to write the second and it's just complete mind blank again. And all the same challenges are still there. You still have to work through. And then, of course, it's different because someone's kind of waiting for it at the end of your second one. You've got, an agent who wants to read it. And whereas with the first one, as I said, I didn't even really know if I'd finish it or if I'd do anything with it or if anyone else would ever read it except me. Yeah, so it's definitely a different kettle of fish doing the second one, which has surprised me.
Well, and also world building, right? Like world building is a word that we toss around very quickly when it comes to, say, science fiction and fantasy, right? But you build a very convincing world in Whalefall. Very, very convincing world. I was standing on a rocky outcropping right in front of a shoal thinking, please do not get hit by a wave or the dead whale carcass. But that's part of the joy of reading this book, right? And so what did you learn about world building as you were writing Whalefall? Because even though this is a very tightly written, 200 pages, tiny, 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 tiny chapters, I feel like you had to figure out more than just, do we have paraffin for the lamps kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about how people move and how they talk and all of these things, right?
Yeah. I mean, world building's definitely my favorite part, I think, of writing. That's a big thing I learned about it, is how much I really enjoyed building, as you say, those small details, material details, the kind of objects people would have used and how they would have used them, but also how people would have spoken to each other, what they would have known of the outside world, how that would affect their sense of self, their interiority. I think all of those details and background things is something I really love doing. And with the second one, it's definitely the thing I'm loving doing. Doing the actual plot is the thing I hate. I wish someone could just write out a plot for me and I can do it. But yeah.
Well, we definitely get plot in Whalefall. I don't want people to think there is no plot. You and I have been dancing around it because when it all comes together, you're just, it works so well. I feel like we could easily give up some details that you and I do not want to give up. The story in Whalefall feels inevitable. It feels organic, which to me, that is high compliment, especially for a debut novel. It unrolls as it should, kind of thing. And so knowing that you do have a personal connection to sort of this thing is great. But I never felt like you had done research and I was now learning about. I was plopped into a place and I was like, who are these people? I want to hang out with them. And I want to see where this is going. Not, oh, hey, Elizabeth did a lot of homework and now I'm reading all of her homework and how great is this? I think it's a really clever story. So this is where I say thank you, Elizabeth O'Connor. It was really, really great to hang out with you. Whalefall is out now. And I really hope folks will pick it up. And if you did like Clear by Carys Davies, if you did like This Other Eden by Paul Harding, you absolutely need Whalefall. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Whalefall. I mark at my Cincinnati store, but I'm going to have two of my favorite book buddies take over and recommend books today. I've got Jamie over in Kansas, and I have Donald up in the Detroit area. Jamie, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Donald and I were just talking, I loved Whalefall so much, so much. And I will say, though, if you found the Welsh to be a little bit challenging, then I would highly recommend the audiobook, which had just an excellent narrator, and they'll handle all of those extra Y's and F's and D's for you. I thought she was able to capture the voices of the character and the setting really well in that audiobook as well. And I think what I love about this story is that the setting is almost its own character, right? And so as I was reading, I kept thinking about an author from a kind of nearby island from Scotland named Evie Wyld, who I just adore, and her book, The Bass Rock, which came out just a few years ago. And so, as I said, the book is set in Scotland, in a real-life town, a seaside town called North Berwick. And right out in the ocean stands this big volcanic rock, an island technically, but this Bass Rock is there. And this is the setting for the novel. And it's this windy, remote place where the tale of three women who have lived there over the centuries and their stories and how they intertwine. These three women's stories kind of overlap and sort of swirl around the actual rock for centuries, basically. So first you have Sarah. Sarah is a young woman who is accused of witchcraft. She's living in the early 1700s. And as she flees from persecution by the villagers, she finds herself hiding kind of in the rugged landscape near and around the Bass Rock. The society around her is one that is just absolutely steeped in superstition and in fear. And so her story is really a story of survival against the odds and her navigating the dangers and harsh realities of life as a complete outcast and just independent of any help from anyone else. The second story, we jump way forward in time, and this is my favorite character to spend time with, and that is Ruth. Ruth moves to North Berwick after marrying Peter. He's a widower. He's got two sons, and the family settles into this large isolated house right near the rock. And Ruth's hope for a new life after World War II and the death of her brother and everything she's gone through, she really wants a fresh start, but it's all kind of marred by this sense of displacement and isolation and just this mounting anxiety as she navigates her life as a new wife, a loyal wife to a husband who is, as far as she's concerned, not a very loyal husband, right? To being a stepmother to these two boys who seem to kind of always be endangered. And as an outsider in a small town where villagers kind of view her with suspicion. So if you're going to add to that mix a clergyman who seems worryingly interested in her boys, and the unsettling presence of the rock and the isolation, it all kind of adds up to this sort of brittle, really tense kind of feeling in her story. Finally, Viv is your third story, and that is she's a present-day modern woman who, mourning the loss of her own father, has returned to the house to sort through Ruth's belongings. And it is through her then that we kind of get to piece together these three stories. So I don't want to say it's not presented as three separate stories. I just separate them to kind of tell you who they are. Like I said at the beginning, it's a lot of overlapping and swirling and blending of narrative. And Evie Wyld is so good at that. If you read her other book, All the Birds Singing, you know what a fantastic writer she is. And the rock itself, it really left a mark on my mind after I read this book. I loved how it kind of loomed there, this kind of witness to these women and all the different things that they went through. So again, that's Bass Rock by Evie Wyld. I also am going to say, as I hand it off to Donald, she does have a new book coming. It's already published in the UK and it is publishing stateside next year. So watch out for that. All right, Donald, what have you got for us?
Well, just like you, Jamie, I want to say that Whalefall is amazing. But one of the things that I think I find so fascinating about this book and many of the other short novels that have been coming out lately is, while there's this idea that you want to read them quickly because they're short and you can fit them in, and you definitely can, you also want to just live in the language. So you slow it down a little bit. Whalefall, you experience it much better if you read it slowly. Read one of the passages at a time. Let it set in. And so the books, I actually have two. And I'm going to talk really quickly about both of them because I couldn't pick one. One is The Heart in Winter, out not too long ago. And then the other one is Clear by Carys Davies. And the reason why I looked at both of these books as companions to Whalefall is they're both short novels. They're both atmospheric. They're both about isolation. They're about relationships. They are historical, but they also have a really important sense of place. You are immediately drawn into the worlds of both Clear and The Heart in Winter, immediately pulled into the language, the characters. They're not like anything you've read before, right? So each one of these, even Whalefall, they all are their own thing. You almost feel like you're in a different universe with these books because of the way they're presented. But they all deal with a lot of similar things. They all deal, again, with isolation. They're dealing with how one person or a relationship can threaten the fabric of that small society, even if it's vast, like the West. Settings, I think you said this too, Jamie, settings are their own character. So in both Clear and A Heart in Winter, the settings themselves are very much a part of the story, and you have to listen to the wind blowing, the water crashing on the rocks. You have to experience that as if they're talking to you just as much as a character is. They're also about escape and how we all want to escape the life we have in some moments, and yet for us as readers and fans of literature, I want to live in all of these worlds, right? Like I want to live in each of these different places. So you are pulled in immediately to these books, and I think that why I looked at both of these and why The Heart in Winter also stood out to me was it is poetic in a way that you just don't always get from full-size, big, giant novels. And I think that short stories and novellas and these short novels really allow writers to express in such unique language. And so again, the two books that I picked were Clear by Carys Davies and Winter by Kevin Barry. So that is what I have for you for this book.
Oh my gosh, you two. I wish that I could be customers in your stores sometimes. The way that you both talk about books just makes my heart so big. And Big shout out to Evie Wyld. I love her so much. So Jamie, yes, you and I are very much on the same page with mega fans of hers. And Donald, I loved Clear by Davies, and I have a copy of The Heart in Winter at home ready to read. Whalefall is the top of my TBR list right now once I finish a few others, but as you were both speaking, I downloaded the audio for Whalefall so I can listen to it and then jump back in and read it again. So thank you both. You're wonderful, as always. But that is all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Jamie, where can we find you?
I'm at BN Plaza KC.
And Donald, where can we find you in your wonderful store?
You can find me at BN Fairlane Green.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.